This presentation gives a brief introduction to some of the philosophical ideas behind determinism, and then goes on to look at how this might impact on contemporary educational practices in schools. The idea that there are specific genes that are exclusively for social behaviours is a myth. It's a dangerous myth because it possibly legitimises the idea that it is acceptable to impose treatments or interventions on people who show social behaviours that we disapprove of. Genes are generalists and influence many characteristics. Criminality and social inequality may be influenced by genes, but how they do this is barely begun to be understood. And we certainly cannot make any definitive statements about causal mechanisms. However, the idea that there might be simplistic solutions to complex behavioural problems is an attractive one, be that a drug, a behaviour change, or even a research project. This is one idea why the myth persists. It implies that we are attracted to simple explanations for our behaviours. It is easy to explain, and it sells books, as we shall see. Determinism is the philosophical idea that every event and action is causally determined by an unbroken chain of prior occurrences. That every decision we make is somehow influenced by changes that have occurred in the past. It implies that the world is a complex machine, and if we understood how this machine worked perfectly, then it would be behaving in a predictable way and we would be able to predict the future. Determinism is powerfully tied up with the idea of destiny. It also implies that people behave in certain predictable ways, and that in a stratified society, every individual will stay in the social situation in which they were born. Robert Plomin's book, entitled Blueprint, is designed to be attractive to deterministic thinkers. He believes his audience are those who are interested in science and the social sciences. Notice how he sells the idea of the book in these opening paragraphs. And the fortune teller is DNA. Robert Plomin explains his position in detail in a promotional video made by Penguin, which is available on YouTube. When Robert Plomin says that DNA is a fortune teller and that our destiny is tied to our DNA, he is using a very old philosophical idea called pre-formatism, which originated with the ancient Greek thinkers such as Empedocles. Pre-formation means the existence of all the characteristics of an organism in a rudimentary form in the newly fertilized egg. Ideas of pre-formation can be traced back to at least 450 BC. Blending male and female sexual material produces the embryo, and the embryo is the result of the male and female sexual material and directly produces the characteristics of the child. The earliest geneticists, such as Bateson, adopted this reductionist preformative concepts into his thinking about genes, and they passed into mainstream genetics. The idea that a gene is a discrete material particle is also a preformative idea. If we merely consider each gene as a determinant for some definite character in the adult, such as when we say the gene for blue eyes or the gene for fair hair, then all we are doing is repeating these old preformative ideas. However, even in the time of the ancient Greeks, this preformative idea was not the only mainstream thought. The contrasting idea was the idea of epigenesis. The idea of epigenesis can be traced back to Aristotle. The main ideas are that the characteristics of the adult do not exist preformed in the newly fertilized egg, but arise gradually through a series of causal interactions between the components of the fertilized egg and its external environment. For Aristotle, the causes of development lie internal to the combined fluids rather than outside. An individual life begins when the male and female semen are brought together. This is an external action, but it starts the individual development process in motion. From that point on, the development process is internal and driven by internal causes in interaction with the external environment. This process, this interaction, leads to the development of form of the individual's type. Plomin's arguments about a blueprint are curious and worth further examination. He says that the blueprint is a plan, but it's not the same as the finished three-dimensional structure. But this is reinterpreting what a blueprint is. In architecture, a blueprint is a representation of the structure of the building. To say that the blueprint is not the same as the finished structure because we don't look like a double helix conveniently overlooks the idea that the blueprint contains the information that is used to build the three-dimensional structure. It's like saying that a finished house is not like the blueprint because it's not made of paper. Plomin recognises that the environment, and especially the non-shared environment, will lead to the development of differences between people within families. This is moving towards an epigenetic position. However, he continually asserts that the dominant factor in this interaction is genetic, and that the environment merely knocks the individual's development off its pre-programmed trajectory. So even here, Plomin is at heart arguing from a hereditarian position. Epigenesis is being developed in a new branch of science called epigenetics, which is studying how environmental stimuli alter the expression of genes. Epigenetics is interesting in the development changes that occur to a person across their lives, or across their life courses, as they describe it. It believes that a person's individuality arises through an interaction of their genetic factors, their nature, and their environmental factors, their nurture. Thus nature via nurture. Whereas preformatists emphasize the importance of genetic factors or inherited differences between people and the importance of nature. Robert Plomin is perfectly well aware of the philosophical differences between these two approaches, and his book includes the statement here in which he very much argues from an epigenetic position. However, the balance of the book is unmistakably hereditarian. The polygenic scores for educational attainment suggest that most of the variation in scores is not caused by inherited factors. So the argument proposed that DNA is our fortune teller is not borne out by the data, some would say, not yet borne out by the data. Reductionists like Plomin tend to argue that in time, with more data and more elaborate technologies, polygenic scores will become a reliable predictor of educational attainment at the level of the individual. However, if we use a philosophical lens based on epigenesis, we could argue that this can never be so.